Mauga just got a hotfix nerf that came through yesterday, got some playtime on the new version of Mauga, so have some up-to-date thoughts on the character. The developers also did an AMA with topics that range from reworks coming to characters like Wrecking Ball and Reaper, as well as more discussion on their tests on hero bans that will be coming. First of all, the Mauga nerfs. The chain gun damage has been reduced from 5 to 4 per shot, and the number of shots with the incendiary chain gun to ignite enemies has increased from 10 to 15. Cage fight loses 2 seconds on the ultimate duration. I personally think these nerfs were fairly heavy-handed. I'm glad I didn't make a tier list yet, because I knew they were going to be doing one final stage of rebalancing before Mauga enters competitive coming next week, but this one flips him upside down, I think. The devs do explain that, surprisingly, during the BlizzCon trial, Mauga was actually performing much better than community perception, but there were some issues with his survivability with things like his head hitbox size, which is why they buffed him so much on the release to the main game in Season 8. In a couple instances in the Reddit AMA, the devs were asked about Mauga's survivability, and it turns out this recent nerf to lower his damage is kind of intended to do that, since he lifesteals such a high percentage of the damage he's dealing. And in fact, that's how you're going to find yourself being able to lock into a fight and survive as Mauga, is finding something you can life leech on, use your cardiac overdrive, and 70% lifesteal, which is a number they buffed. Didn't change though in the recent nerfs. So overall, less damage also means less survivability, but also all the other knock-on effects we have to remember, such as time to kill thresholds, or the time it takes to build your ultimate. Now, I'll admit, this is a character that you can't judge too quickly, as adapting to his very complex kit is pretty required. In my experience though, with these new nerfs, I feel there's a lot of squishy targets that feel kind of impossible to kill at medium range with the dual weapons, at least when trying to fire both chain guns at the same time, despite them increasing the tightness of the spread in that Season 8 release patch. I haven't had time to implement what I think you need to do now, and that's against smaller hitbox targets, only use one of the weapons, even at a closer range than you're used to prior, because you used to be able to just like light things up and deal so much haphazard shotgun spread damage spraying away that you would kind of be able to mow down anything, even smaller targets. But I think that's changed significantly. And then on top of that, the incendiary fire, setting them on fire, takes longer now at 15 shots. I think he certainly needs more skill to play than before. And I'm not so happy with them leaving the 70% lifesteal amount, but then dropping the damage, because I feel like regardless, his sustainability is never going to be his strong suit anyway, unless you're outplaying things that don't counter you. But who doesn't counter the enemy tank, you know? So instead, as a tank, you need to learn how to outplay the things that do counter you, especially in consideration with a lot of the other tank improvements that came to the role. I think my opinion has actually dropped on Mauga, but we'll wait until the tier list next week with a bit more playtime before I give my final ranking on where I think he lands. The devs do explain his matchups, at least the ones that they understand internally. The devs say that Mauga has bad matchups against Sigma and Diva, who can turn off his lifesteal by denying his damage. He says Hog, Queen, and Ramatra are fairly even matchups. Zarya and Ryan can do decently, but require more support from the team. And Mauga is strongest against dive tanks and Orisa, notably not Diva, I suppose. She's under the other category, but as you might imagine, he does light up Winston as well as Wrecking Ball. However, I do think mobility can also outplay him by ignoring him, and I'm actually surprised that he says that Orisa is a very good matchup for Mauga, because I feel like she has the anti-damage buttons similar to what Sigma and Diva has. She also has a spinny spear, which denies damage. So I'm not sure if I would say Mauga is like good against Orisa. Now maybe with his charge ability not being stoppable, she can't CC him like she normally can do against other tanks, but I'm not sure you target the Orisa and easily win like you can against some other tanks. I think the Overwatch community really is most comfortable when just your tank counters the enemy tank, because it requires the least amount of positioning finesse, as opposed to your tank ignores the enemy tank and goes at the backline. While that can be powerful, it also means that your backline is left high and dry and needs to outposition their tank. Anti Nade has been a subject of community discussion for a while due to its all-in nature. Makes Ana feel like that old Hearthstone card, Big Game Hunter, in my opinion, being able to to have quite an uptrade to use one ability to effectively shut down what is supposed to be the strongest enemy on their team, the tank. Josh No responds about anti-heal by saying this: anti-heal is a useful mechanic for the overall health of the game, as it helps to ensure that healing never gets far too out of control. The complaints about it feeling oppressive are understandable, because no one wants to get hit with a debuff, and we'll be looking for ways to soften its impact while keeping Ana a viable hero. The simplest solution here is decreasing the duration of the effect, though there is certainly a point where it swings from feeling OP to not useful enough if the time is too low to capitalize on. The reaction around it does also suggest that healing is probably too impactful overall, so we'll be looking to address that in the near future as well. Remember, guys, they did talk about that in our previous video. They're systematically looking at the burst, damage, and healing, so I think that's what he's alluding to here. Whether that is handled in the case of individual heroes like Roadhog Take a Breather or more systematically. Personally, I don't really mind the boom or bust nature of counter picks in this game, because I think what would be worse is if the game was muted down to where the abilities don't feel impactful. What I think is kind of funny in this game is, like, so many people complain about Anti Nade, but they don't necessarily think of the world of what it would be like when you're playing against Moira and Lifeweaver every game, and everything's just kind of like vaguely getting lots of healing stats and escapability. That's far less fun to me. Josh No seems to imply here that they might consider some sort of anti-heal resistance on Roadhog's Take a Breather, for example, so that the whole character isn't shut down. Or is it more systematic, like Anti Nade has a lessened effect, either lessened severity or lessened duration on tank heroes? If we think back to the year plus of Overwatch 2's life, Ana has kind of either been a boom or bust hero. And personally, for me, the game's played better with Ana. There's more big, cool moments happening. Hero shooter game, get in there, make things explode. Now, going further on this counter watch discussion about the concept of balance, just like what are they even going for, Josh No explains in saying this: an important aspect of our hero design philosophy is that heroes should have clear strengths and weaknesses to create more varied and interesting gameplay. When we look to buff a hero, for example, we want to keep this in mind and typically try to focus on heroes' intended strengths rather than clearing away their weaknesses. And I think you guys can just hear in the words they're saying, this is what kind of creates counter watch, because if everyone has an edge, you'll always be able to be countered. He goes on to say, we do want to avoid counters being too easy and effective without adequate counter play. That's a term I think the community should start to learn. The tactics to outplay your counter. Counterplay options. He says, there is a broad goal of making sure every hero choice is viable in some capacity and feels good to play, while hopefully not feeling too unfair to play against. Some direct matchups are not reasonably close, like Winston versus Roadhog, but we don't strictly balance off 1v1 matchups, as Overwatch is a team game. Winston has a chance to win by going after everyone that is not Roadhog, for example. Generally, we find that when heroes are balanced closely enough, individual player performance and teamwork has significantly more impact on the outcome of a match than the hero choice does, unless you reach the highest levels of competition. Ah, yes. A quiet get good scrub put in at the end of the blog post. He is right, though. Like, if you understand the game and your character, this is why one tricks can succeed. Like, they do win a percentage of the time when the entire enemy team is countering them. Because Overwatch 2 specifically is a matchup-based game where you can win by avoiding your bad matchups and just going at full speed your good matchups. Because at the end of the day, player advantage, ult economy, and execution always outweighs the enemy picking the right heroes from a macro team strategy point of view. A rework that they discussed, this was in an extension to the Wrecking Ball rework we know we're getting. Reaper is on the list of characters they're trying to modernize. Their goals to make Shadow Step and Wraith form make more sense for the modern state of the game. They say they may also explore some new abilities for Reaper, on right click for example, but don't want to take that space just because it's available. We'll want it to give him slightly more decision making in combat than he has currently. I'm a big fan of Reaper because he's an easy hero that does a lot for the team in a role that otherwise is typically pretty high skill. And I actually do think in many ways they did update Reaper in Overwatch 1, where Shadow Step got more and more useful. You could use it while getting knocked off the map, for example, saving Reaper always from getting knocked off the point, which was typical on Control, making him one of the better heroes on there, but also just allowing him for a lot more movement flexibility on his somewhat outdated movement ability. and reloading during Wraith form and being able to cancel Wraith form. I mean, y'all who didn't play the game in 2016 have no idea how much more clunky Reaper was at the initial launch inception version. They already did make him a lot more fluid in how he's able to move, despite him still kind of standing out as one of the less fluid options. I say all that, and by most analysts, I think Reaper's considered one of the worst DPS heroes overall. But funnily enough, he's so reliable that he sort of has a Moira effect where if you just execute his gameplay loop, he gets tons of value. And usually the counter, just like Moira, is hit crits against them. Then they look silly. But otherwise, they sort of just run you over with stats. He says that they may add an ult fire, but they want it to make him have more decision-making in combat. So another character they gave an ult fire to in Overwatch 2 was Winston, which was quite a flexibility buff, but I don't think we're going to be getting just a simple ranged attack to Reaper if it needs to be decision-making. Their current trend of favorite things to give heroes is like a trap ability, but I'll guarantee you he won't get that because everybody knows they've overdone the traps. So maybe like a grenade. In the reveal cinematic so many years ago for Overwatch 1, Reaper seemed to have like shadows and smoke. So maybe some sort of like status effect grenade. I think it's safe to say they'll like tune up his kit and then add an extra layer of complexity, as that seemingly has been the strategy for just about every hero in the 5v5 format, which allows for maximal individual agency, but it also has given us the counterpick game that we have with the sequel. And I don't think that trend is stopping anytime soon. I will assume similar changes to the aforementioned Wrecking Ball rework they're working on. Alec Dawson says they play tested the first round of Wrecking Ball changes last week and think it's off to a good start. Overall, we are looking at making it a bit easier to play alongside Wrecking Ball with various support heroes to increase Ball's options in combat and implement some quality of life changes. So 3 major goals there. In terms of timeline, it will depend how far we go with some of the changes and what's required there. It could end up as a bigger balance patch. It could end up giving Wrecking Ball a new ability. Right now, though, I think it'll lean closer to the first and not need the same sort of support that Roadhog and Sombra needed. Hopefully getting something out there in the next few seasons. I mean, that's a pretty wide window. So the next few seasons could be 6 months from now, but also shorter, depending on how well this goes. If I can translate the rather big mission they set out for the character's rework, and powerful words in a big sentence here, quality of life changes, I think we know what that is. Like making abilities work like you intend them to, more or less, easier to execute. I think there's a lot of ways they could do that with Ball around Pile Driver, and I think the movement as well. But the more complex ones he states are him playing around various support heroes. So I think some of the worst ones for him are slower supports, which typically seem to fit in with most like brawler type heroes, but Ball, who likes to go in deep, it can be a little bit challenging to sync up with them or get any use of what they do, as opposed to the max mobility style supports that at least can keep up with his insane movement. And I think the key to bridging that gap is what he says here, to increase Ball's options in combat. It's an interesting idea, because if you think about the lack of options in Overwatch 2, it's partially because of the knockback changes on the enemy tank, considering the entire purpose of Ball originally was to displace enemy team comps. In Overwatch 1, it was common to have 6 players all teamed up together, holding hands in a death ball, and Wrecking Ball was kind of amazing at splitting them up. Well, the gameplay in Overwatch 2 is a little bit more formulaic in terms of how everyone will be positioned on the map. In a good way, in my opinion. It makes the game more playable, but it also makes Ball less severe in what we expect a Overwatch 2 counterpick style character to be, because you're just not moving the enemy tank. Also, a lot of enemy tanks have stuns now. Quite a few, because that's how they've just sort of re-engineered the role. My guess is he's going to be better as a frontline brawler in general, somehow. Not saying he'll be Orisa, but I bet he'll be able to contribute to the frontline somehow, whether it's by bypassing the knockback resistance on tanks, or just giving him some benefit that allows him to play the durability frontline tank battle that most tanks can kind of do, whereas Ball just sort of can't, and is more all in on diving squishies the entire game, and then maybe stalling the objective, but worse than a lot of other tanks can do the same. Final subject of the video, hero bans. Alec Dawson clarifies what they're going to be doing or thinking about with hero bans. He says, want to clarify here that the first time we do this, it will be for a limited time as an experiment. With that said, we're still discussing on how exactly it will work in the match flow and where we should put this experiment. Should everyone get a ban against one hero in their role? Should this experiment actually run in competitive for a weekend, or should it get its own queue? How long is the phase before you select heroes? How much time does a team need to feel like they are strategizing, but not so long it significantly increases the match length? I also think there's a rather long assembling your team section of the game anyway that hardly anyone talks or strategizes to begin with. So in my opinion, just adding the hero ban phase during that, I'm sure you'll have enough time. But he goes on to say, those are sorts of questions we talk about in our design meetings around this. He says, I think any sort of ban system in Overwatch has the chance to be fairly polarizing, especially when your main gets banned. The point of the experiment will be to gather some initial feedback and make sure that if we ever move forward with permanently adding bans, we've covered all our bases. As we said earlier in the video, skill can outweigh getting countered. Definitely true. But from an enjoyment of the game standpoint, having some games where being able to play your hero and eliminating some of your worst matchups is an empowering feeling. So much so that I personally will take the games where I'm disempowered, but I also play a lot of heroes and love the counterpicking aspect anyway. There still will be counterpicks. They'll just be the less optimal ones. I think, like, for example, one at the top of everyone's tongue from the last couple seasons has been Bastion, who sort of just holds his position and zones out or just hardcore counters tanks. And that's all he does. And he was sort of the best at it. But if you could ban him, would players play more Reaper or maybe Mei to do that, but with less oppressive stats, I think most people would say. Because both of those characters require more risk to get similar value. And for me personally, as I've wanted for many, many years, would be a big boon to the playability of the game, because you'll still get bad matchups, bad matches, bad games in Overwatch, but that already happens now. I think more important is having some games where you feel empowered to play your game, especially as these heroes that have the harshest of counters now. Because it's not just the tanks. There's also, like, Widowmaker, for example. Got beaten into the ground to make sure she doesn't dominate the game. And I think the game experience of Overwatch is so boom or bust anyway, because even if the game is balanced with the entire global population playing all the heroes in mind, it doesn't mean your 5 teammates can play any of those that are intended to level out the situation you're in. So regardless, the gameplay experience is boom or bust. But you could craft that experience into your corner a bigger percentage of the time, which I think matters the most for niche picks or easily countered ones. But giving one that feels robust and transformative to the format, I would prefer over them, like, just stepping their toe in, getting a non-result. Like, don't do that. Make it polarizing. This is a polarizing game. So what? I think they should design the game for the players that actually like it and will keep playing it, as opposed to the peanut gallery who want to experience the smallest portion of the game just for themselves. And there always was functionally 0% chance to make everyone who fits that kind of description happy, because they all have competing interests. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like, and don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.